So my name is Nate Krippis. I'm the Public Affairs Supervising Attorney with the Disability Law Center. I will be joined by my colleague Andrew Riggle, our Public Policy Advocate. We work for the Disability Law Center. We're the state's protection and advocacy agency. We seek to protect and advance the legal rights of people with disabilities. The DLC does that in a variety of ways. We do some individual casework on behalf of individuals, everything from low-level interventions all the way up to individual case litigation and systemic litigation, trying to advance those rights. But Andrew and I work on our public policy team, which means we try to advance rights and protect rights through public policy. And that can look a variety of ways. I think, we work with our federal delegation, our US senators and representatives, and working with them and trying to make sure federal law is, either rights are protected or advanced. And we go all the way down to, mayors and county governments and things of that nature, trying to advocate for things at that level. But today, obviously, everyone is here to learn about the Utah State Legislature and a little bit about that process. And that is something that Andrew and I do a lot of. We do some public policy advocacy with the state legislature. And so we want to kind of talk a little bit about the legislative process. I joked, for anyone who already heard it, about it's a little bit like the Schoolhouse Rock. We're going to tell you how a bill becomes a law. Far less exciting, I assure you, than that video was. But we're still going to go through it. And so, let's see, sorry, I need to make sure I'm on here and then I can advance slides. Yes. Yay. Okay, we're doing it. Believe me, if you weren't here last time, this went much, much worse. The first 5 minutes were far worse than this. You're catching us at the right time. We're going to nail this one. So anyway, the Utah State Legislature at the most basic level makes and changes state law and sets the state budget. And so we're going to go through how they go about that. But just kind of as an initial matter, I think that's helpful to just start there. There's Utah State Code, which is the laws of the state. If there is something that needs to be added, if there is something that needs to be changed, if there is something that doesn't need to be changed, but some legislators think it should be, this is the process to do that. And if there is, money to be appropriated in the state for whatever the budget is, whatever the state is going to spend its money on, the legislature ultimately is going to set it. Obviously, there is in the federal government, there are 3 branches. So, there's the governor is involved, and there's obviously other matters that have to be determined by the courts. But at the end of the day, the legislature kind of is the one driving this process. And with that, I will turn it over Andrew to kind of start talking about that process.
Nate, if you are able to, I've noticed a couple. I haven't been able to keep up with it, but I've noticed a couple of things popping up in the chat. So if you're able to, if you want to keep an eye on that, that would be great.
It looks like some people want to be moved, and I would love to be able to move you to another room, but I have no idea how to do that. I can try and email Aubrey and let her know about folks that want to be moved. If
yeah, doesn't we have, I think we had the ability to do that last session. It doesn't look like we've been given that same ability this session.
Okay. And actually, for that matter, Andrew, I thought it said at one point this was recording, but now I'm not sure that it is, and it doesn't look like we have the ability to do that.
There, it is in the upper left-hand corner. It says recording. So.
Oh, cool. Then never mind.
All right. Well,
if I can figure out a way to move people, I will. That is what I will say.
While you try to figure that out, I will go ahead. And
Andrew, just real quick, Andrew, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I see somebody, Steve says, if you leave the room, you will go to the main room and they can put you in a different one. Sorry, just want to make sure everyone gets that bit if they didn't see it in the chat. Go ahead, Andrew.
So this is these first 2 slides are going to be a high-level overview of the of the entire legislative process, and then in later slides, we will get into a few more specifics about how each phase, each part of the process works. So the first step are departmental hearings, which give clients, providers, and other. Oh, and this takes place. The process begins usually in between June and August. So this is when we're starting. Departmental hearings give clients, providers, and others interested in government services a chance to tell departmental leaders how they think programs need to improve or change. They're also the first step in the budget process. In September, the department adds what they've heard from the public to their own suggestions and send the list of prioritized recommendations to the governor. After reviewing priorities from all departments, the governor releases his budget, usually towards the beginning of December. While legislators say they don't pay much attention to it, it's important for a couple of reasons. The first one is that departments are only allowed to publicly support what's in the governor's budget, and the second one is that the governor and legislature have to agree on a budget, which means they have to negotiate. The general session, which we're just beginning now, is when most laws are passed and next year's budget is adopted. The fact that Utah has one of the shortest sessions in the country means there's often little time for thoughtful conversation on important decisions or big issues. Because most legislators have regular jobs as well, they depend on experts like you to tell them what they need to know. It's why it's important to connect and build a relationship with them before January. And finally, a special session is called when a mistake is discovered or something happens that can't wait until January to be fixed. So if you can go to the next slide, Nate, that would be great. Thank you. And this just talks a little bit about interim sessions. Interim committees meet once a month between April and December. These committees give legislators a chance to spend more time thinking and talking about subjects they're interested in exploring. They're also a place where legislators can get input and feedback from the public and their colleagues on ideas they're considering for the coming session. And one last thing I wanted to mention is the legislative management committee also meets once a month to discuss the legislature's rules and talk about how the process itself is working. The Executive Appropriations Committee is made up of leadership from both parties in the House and Senate. When they're not figuring out the budget during the general session, they meet almost every other month to hear reports on how the money is being spent and how much we can expect to have next year. A bill is a proposed law. Oh, that's the next, that's yours, Nate. Sorry about that.
Trying to steal my slides again, Andrew, trying to steal my slides. Moving on a little bit, we're just going to talk a little bit about quickly about the lingo. Obviously, you know, most people are probably familiar with a bill, which is just a proposed law or new program. Then there are appropriations, which is just the budget for existing state programs. So it is similar to a bill, and we'll kind of go into the process of how each of those move forward. But the bill is just, something that is actually a proposed law, whereas an appropriation is just money. And then there's also a resolution, which is usually used to begin a conversation about an issue. It can be the first step towards a bill the next session. Sometimes they can be used to encourage local governments, the governor or Congress to take action on an issue. There's a big resolution being debated right now about Salt Lake County and Summit County's mask mandates, which, as we say, is kind of something to, it's a little bit different. This one actually has some effects. I think generally resolutions are,
Sorry.
They don't really have the force and effect of law. They're just more about kind of making a statement on an issue. So just something to also flag for you. If you see a resolution, that's what it is. So when it comes to moving a bill forward, this is kind of the process it has to go through. So if you or if someone has an idea for a bill or an appropriation, the first step is going to be finding a sponsor. And a sponsor is just a legislator who agrees to present and champion that idea through a committee and the floor to move that bill forward. And so it can be a senator or a representative. It doesn't matter where a bill or what type of legislator decides to ultimately start a bill. But at the end of the day, you will need both a sponsor in both houses. So you will have a sponsor that kind of starts the process, but then they will eventually need a co-sponsor in the other body. So if it starts in the House, then you're going to need a co-sponsor in the Senate eventually to get it through there. Kind of they just help march that bill forward in the other chamber. That's really what it is. Ultimately, your initial sponsor is still going to be the main person moving things forward. But again, this is just a senator or representative. It can be any senator or representative. It doesn't have to be, if you live in a particular legislative district, you are not, and you want to try and get a bill passed, you don't have to work with your senator or representative. It's always a good place to start as a recommendation, but you don't have to actually start with that person. It could be any senator or representative who just may be interested in the issue. So if there's a senator or representative who's passionate about a particular type of thing, it may be better to start there than with yours. And again, so if it's a representative, the bill is going to start in the House. If it's a senator, the bill is going to start in the Senate. And once that bill is introduced, which means they essentially give it a number, you'll hear like HB 175, and that just is the number it's given, which means there's text and there is a bill out there. At that point, usually the bill is, it was sent to Rules Committee, and then they send it to a committee that most closely matches its subject. As I said in the last session, I think there can be weird, wonky rules that change. At the end of the session, not all bills necessarily go to Rules or get a committee assignment. That can happen late in the session. And in addition to that, I think when I say a committee that most closely matches its subject, that is suspect. Sometimes a bill can end up in a place where it doesn't really match where it should go. Andrew, do you have an example? It looks like you may have an example of that.
How did you guess, Nate? I actually have a really entertaining example of that. I was working in a past year. I was working to get a preferred drug list passed in a preferred drug list for Medicaid passed, and there was significant support for it, but there was also significant opposition to it, and some of the folks who were not quite as in favor of it were members of the Rules Committee. So instead of assigning the bill to the Health and Human Services Committee, where something on the topic of drugs would normally go, they assigned it to the Agriculture Committee because they knew that there was less of a chance that there would be members on the Agriculture Committee who knew much about medication, and so they had a better chance of the bill not passing in that committee than they would in the Health and Human Services Committee. So that's one of the most standout examples of a rules committee assigning a bill to a committee that has absolutely nothing to do with the subject matter that they're being asked to vote on.
And I think that is probably the key. If you see a bill end up, something like Andrew's mentioning, end up in a very strange committee, like a bill related to prescription drugs ending up in agriculture, it's usually a sign that somebody in rules wants that bill not to have a whole lot of success. They're not assigning it to agriculture because they really want you to move that forward. I think that's one of the things you'll see, some of the shenanigans of the Utah State Legislature to try and make a bill harder to pass. So just it should go to, if it's a healthcare related bill like Health and Human Services or something like that, but it's always possible to kind of move it somewhere else. So and so as we mentioned, it goes into a committee, and we've given a few examples already, but these are standing committees, is what they're essentially called. Some examples we've already mentioned: Health and Human Services, but there's business and labor, law enforcement and criminal justice, government operations. There's a bunch of different standing committees, and essentially they listen to information about a bill and hear from members of the public in support for it and against it. And then after that, they generally vote on whether to favorably recommend the bill. And then if there are enough votes, the bill would pass the committee. And so at that point, if it is successful in a committee, at that point it moves to the full body. And so if it were something that started with a representative, as we mentioned earlier, it's going to go to the House, so it would have been in a House committee. And if it started with a senator, it would at that point have gone through a Senate committee and would now move to the Senate. Once a bill hits the floor, and we'll start with the House. So if a bill goes to the House, and the process is mostly similar, but there are just some differences I'll talk about. But on the floor, the bill's sponsor at that point would get a few minutes to present it to all of their fellow representatives or senators. At that point, there's really no opportunity for like public testimony or public comment. However, I think one of the things you can do is if you're working with a legislator or anything like that, you can always, or even if it's a bill you're interested in and you're working with a legislator on something else, they have the opportunity to ask questions and bring up issues and make that kind of a discussion with the whole body. And so you can always email, text, or whatever with a legislator and say, hey, I have a concern about this bill, or this is something, or I really like this bill and this is why. You can have them make that statement on the floor. So it's an opportunity to do some advocacy if you're inclined while a bill is on the floor. It's still there. You can't yourself, but if you can get a legislator to, they can. And so if a bill is in the House and it is on the floor, at that point it has to receive 38 yes votes to pass the House. At which point it would go to the Senate. And if it passes the Senate, then it goes on to the governor. If something starts in the Senate, again, the process is the same, except it has to be presented on the floor twice. Again, I think that's a usually. As you get to the end of the session, they will often suspend the rules and there will be no more, they'll just do a third reading. Sometimes you'll see second reading and third reading of a bill. In the Senate, essentially it has to pass the Senate twice. It has to do a second reading where they all vote on it. And if it gets at least 15 votes, it moves to third reading. And then if it gets 15 votes again, it would pass the Senate and go to the House if it hasn't passed there, or go to the governor if it has. But it does have to go through both of those readings. But again, sometimes I would say the last week or two of the session, you're going to see bills that are not going to have to go through two readings. They're going to essentially say, we're going to suspend the rules, and just one reading is enough for the Senate at that point. So you will see that towards the end. So that's kind of the process that a bill goes through. I'm going to turn over to Andrew now to talk a little bit about appropriations and how that process works. And I will, sorry, Andrew, I'll get you to the next slide and you go ahead.
Yeah, there are, as the slide notes, there are two kinds of funding for the most part. Ongoing funding comes from taxes, fees, or other charges that generate about the same amount each year. This means it's unusual for ongoing funding to go up or down very much. That means it's good for programs or people. Things we want to almost guarantee will be around next year and the year after that and the year after that. On the other hand, one-time funding is generated by things that can change a lot from year to year, like sales tax or COVID-19 relief money. Because it's not guaranteed to be there next year, it's good for things we only have to buy once, like buildings or roads. While the state spends quite a bit to support, the reason this is here is because they've also Aubrey also asked us to talk a little bit about the funding streams or where the money comes from. So that's why these next two pieces are here. The state spends quite a bit to support Utahns with disabilities and those who are aging, and we're most of that money, not all of it, but most of that money is Medicaid money, and we're lucky that the federal government contributes about $3 for every $1 that Utah spends. Sadly, the feds don't just give us the money. The state has to spend our money first, and then Medicaid matches it, and that's where for every $1 we spend, federal Medicaid gives us about $3. Even so, legislators' problem this year and every year is that many of the needs we have, like paying direct support workers more, are long term. However, most of the money they have is short term. So now we can go on to the next slide, Nate. And we won't spend too much time on the departmental side of this slide because we already talked about most of how that works related to the governor's budget earlier. So on the right hand slide, you have you see the legislature listed in the and the process for an appropriation or a request for additional money for an existing program or new money for a new program is quite similar to getting the process for getting a bill passed that Nate talked about. But the committees involved in this are different. And the sub appropriations committee is like a standing committee for a bill, except for appropriations requests and budget items. So examples of appropriations committees include public education appropriations, social services appropriations, workforce and economic development appropriations, executive offices and criminal justice appropriations. So that gives you a sense there. The process is very much like getting a recommendation in the governor's budget. The appropriations committee for most of our programs is likely to be social services appropriations, and the social services appropriations committee will hear we'll hear input from departmental staff on issues and budget items and presentations, and they will get information from departmental staff on the items that the governor has recommended. They can also ask, departmental staff can't advocate for things that are not included in the governor's budget, but appropriations committee members can ask departmental staff for information or to respond to questions about other requests for money that might come up during conversation. Similarly, unlike standing committees, appropriations committees tend to rely on their paid staff quite a bit more to put information together for them and answer technical questions for them, because as you might imagine, there's a lot in the budget and some of it is quite complex and difficult and hard to understand if you don't work with the ins and outs of it every single day. So staff has quite a bit more of a role to play here than they do in the bill process usually. So the appropriations committee, they will hear, as I said, they will hear from departments, they will hear from their staff, and they will hear from members of the public and interested stakeholders who want to share ideas or perspectives with them. After hearing all of this, they will get together and talk through it as a committee, and they will come out of the process with a list that is ranked of items that are ranked according to the priority in which the committee members feel like they should be considered for funding in the final budget. This list, along with the list from all of the other appropriations committees, goes to executive appropriations. Executive appropriations is made up of legislative leadership. This is leadership from both parties and both bodies, the Senate and the House, and the executive appropriations committee will go through a very, very similar process to the regular appropriations committees, in that they will take the recommendations from all of the appropriations committees and rank and prioritize them and vote on which ones they think should be funded and which ones shouldn't. The main difference here is that there is very little to no chance that there will be an opportunity for public input or public comment during committee meetings. This doesn't mean that you can't reach out to members of the committee through text or email or calls, like Nate said, and advocate for items that are important to you or your family members. There's just no formal opportunity to do it at this point. Once the executive appropriations committee ranks its list and makes its recommendations, they enter into negotiations with the governor. This is where the governor comes back into the process, because remember, the governor put out his budget with recommendations, and legislators usually will say, that's great, thanks, but no thanks. The budget is only used, the budget, his recommendations are only useful in that the departments can speak to those. This is where the governor comes back into the process, because the governor has to has to sign the budget that the legislature passes. They have to negotiate with each other and do some trading for, okay, this is how much money we have, and these are my priorities and these are your priorities. So let's figure out a list of items that we can all agree on that fit within the amount of money that we have. And once both the legislature and the governor agree on those priorities and those items, that then becomes the state budget. And if you could go to the next slide, Nate. This is, I just wanted to give you all a quick introduction to the legislative website. If you haven't been there already, it's le.utah.gov. And this is not the, this is the first page that you will see. If you click on resources down there at the bottom at the left, this is the page that you will see. At the top, there is the search box in which you can find information about legislators. And you can look up specific legislators, specific bills, or other items. And it's just a quick and dirty way to find what you're interested in if you have a specific item that you're looking for, item or piece of information that you're looking for. The other pieces I wanted to note for you on this page are the items on the left side in the red box. These are links that you can use to find out about new bills that have been introduced recently. So I checked, Nate and I check these regularly every day to make sure that we know what's been introduced new today. And they also are, and you can also use these links to track bills or subjects or topics that you are interested in throughout the process. So, and then I wanted to highlight that red box in the middle. That is a link with a good document from Legislative Research and General Counsel, who are the attorneys who write the bills for legislators. This document has good information about how to participate virtually in legislative meetings, and by participate I mean either watch, listen to, or give comment or testimony during meetings if you are not comfortable, or if it is not logistically possible for you to come up to the Capitol and be present in the room in person. That link will give you good information about how you can still be part of the discussion virtually. So, and then if you can go back one slide, Nate. If you can't, that's okay, because I can walk people through it.
Sorry, the screen sharing stopped for some reason. 1 second. Let me see if I can find that again. And I think, Andrew, just FYI, I think we're going to run out of time here shortly. So I just want to, we do have one question. So let me.
Okay, I can just quickly walk people through the last slide, and then we can get to questions. The last slide was just a screenshot of the legislative calendar, which you can get to by clicking on the middle tab at the bottom of that page. And the calendar has, if you click on the name of the committee, it will take you to information from each of the committee's meetings, both past and present, so you can see all the materials that they are talking about and have access to most of the same things that they do. And the last, as well as schedules and links to watch or listen to it. The last one I wanted to mention is on the right. You can click at the bottom, you can click on that to find your senator or representative and how to contact them. And that is all.
And I have like 30 seconds. And Steve, I'm going to try and answer your question in 30 seconds. So you asked, when a bill makes out of one chamber, it goes immediately to the floor of the other chamber without going to the second chamber's committee. The simple answer to that is it depends. It depends on what part of the session you're in. At the beginning of the session, usually they'll try and get it through both committees. It'll go from a standing committee in the House to a standing committee in the Senate if it passes the House, or vice versa. I would say once you get later in the session, they try to at least get it to one committee as you get later. And then at some point, honestly, some bills go to no committees. And so that it just kind of depends what part of the session you're at, but it should theoretically in process go through both.